Hello, everybody. Welcome, and thank you for coming to our webinar. This is being presented by the Asian Pacific Institute on Gender-Based Violence, and in honor of Domestic Violence Awareness Month, we'll be talking about evidence-informed practices to serve Asian, Pacific Islander, and domestic violence survivors. My name is Chick Dabby, and I will be presenting, and I encourage you to put comments and questions in the chat box. I'll try and track those as I'm speaking, and I'll try and pause between sections also to ask if there are any questions. So to start, I want to, sorry, I'm trying to figure out advancing the slides. Alicia, can you?
The arrows are on the bottom left of the PowerPoint, and you can click back and forth.
Okay, thank you. So to start with acknowledgments, I want to thank all the survivors who teach us about the work and to develop programming that meets their needs, and they also inspire us. They are, of course, always at the forefront as agents of change. Other agents of change include all the advocates and activists who are part of our movement and have built a very solid and powerful infrastructure for our work, the communities that we all belong to that sustain us and give us our hopes, and to all of you, I want to thank you for the work that you do. I will be, when I'm speaking about evidence-informed practices, I'll be referring to the A to Z advocacy model, which has been developed and anchored by advocates who serve Asians and Pacific Islanders in the field. And I also want to thank FIPSA, which is the Family Violence and Prevention Services Office, and the Act funds national resource centers and state coalitions to provide training, technical assistance, research, publications, and services. So FIPSA funds all the states and territories in the U.S., and in 2017, they funded over 1,200 shelters, to over almost 250 non-shelter programs, 145 tribal programs, in total serving 1.28 million victims. So I want to thank the FIPSA office and the funding that they provide, which makes all these services for us to do possible. And lastly, I also want to thank Shirley Luo, my colleague here at the Institute, for organizing resources and providing information and technical assistance to all of us. Okay. Next. So before presenting on culturally specific domestic violence trends, dynamics, and interventions for Asian Pacific Islander communities, I just want to make a few remarks about the culture of gender-based violence. All too often when we think of culture, we think of ethnic culture or identity-specific cultures, but actually we are also surrounded and live in a culture of gender-based violence, which is perpetuated by devaluation, and it's legitimized, obscured, and denied by familial and social institutions and systems of the state. This culture of gender-based violence normalizes or minimizes abuse, blames victims and excuses abusers, ignores gender bias, sexism, misogyny. It promotes an aggressive notion of masculinity. It institutionalized women's devaluation of other women, so it kind of normalizes the way other women are also, women participate in the devaluation of women and other marginalized identities. And it uses men's roles and achievements to exonerate them, to excuse their behavior, and to deny the impact of their behavior. As Cory Booker recently reminded all of us, we live in a toxic culture of persistent patriarchy. Next. sorry. Oh, okay. Sorry, advancing the slides. Okay, now we got it right. So in speaking about the culture of gender-based violence, here is the lifetime spiral of gender-based violence. And this was developed by us at the Institute because what we were hearing from survivors in our service programs across the country and what advocates were hearing is that there were lots of other abuses that that domestic violence survivors had been exposed to before they came in for the domestic violence services. I'm quite aware that the type in the font is really tiny. The point is to just to display the range of abuses and issues and the stages of the life course stages over which violence can occur. Next. So the lifetime spiral shows us four things. It shows the historical nature of gender-based violence and how foundational sexism and misogyny are. It also very clearly, of course, demonstrates that violence isn't accidental, which is what so many of us are told, that it was, bad judgment, being in the wrong place at the wrong time, etc. So we see how it's structured historically into our culture. The spiral also shows that there are different types of abuses that girls and women are vulnerable to, and they may experience these at different stages in their life course or across multiple stages in their life course. Different perpetrators are also located across the life course. So this is an important factor to pay attention to because, again, when we're working in the domestic violence or intimate partner context, what we hear about are the direct abusers, the intimate partners who are perpetrating abuse. But again, before people come to our programs, it's quite likely that they've been exposed to other forms of violence and different perpetrators across the life course. And that can range from the incest perpetrator in childhood to the coach in school to the pimp who's trafficking someone as a young adult, to domestic violence, intimate partners, and other abusers across the lifespan in elder abuse, for example. So these different perpetrators across the lifespan also affect how survivors can heal and respond to the issues that they're facing respond to the abuse that they're facing from their intimate partner. And lastly, what the lifetime spiral shows us is how these histories of abuse have affected help seeking. So that's a conclusion we can look at and draw from the spiral, that if there's exposure to abuse over the life course, there are also going to be histories of help seeking. And for many of us, the histories of help seeking can be both positive and negative. So past negative experiences of help seeking influence future attempts. And the young child who's being molested and discloses that to her mother, but if her mother doesn't believe her, then when that child is being raped when she's older, she's not going to tell her mother. So future help seeking is really impacted by past experiences and past attempts at help seeking. And that often explains and helps us understand how when we're providing support to survivors in our programs, that they may not be very receptive because of these past negative experiences. Next. So moving from the broader framework of the culture of gender-based violence, I wanted to talk about ethnic and identity-specific cultures. And again, I would remind us all that there is more to culture than ethnicity, that there are identity-specific cultures that we are also all part of and connected to. There's LGBTQ culture, there's deaf culture, there's regional culture, urban culture, rural, etc. So there are many, identity-specific cultures as well. And I also want to remind us that all ethnic groups have cultural identities. All ethnic groups have gender norms that impact the way we address domestic violence and provide advocacy. So the strengths that culture brings are obvious. It nurtures a whole range of identities that contain the histories of people, traditions, struggles, triumphs. It nourishes pride, resilience, belonging, intersectional identity, and very importantly, it nourishes connection to community. But for all its nourishment, it also brings harm, so it plays this dual role. It prescribes and maintains patriarchal gender norms and roles, defines what are transgressions from these norms, and patrols the boundaries of what's acceptable and what's not acceptable. And it enforces compliance to gender norms and cultural norms through violence, rejection, fear, even death sometimes, and also in more subtle ways, sometimes referred to as death by 1,000 paper cuts. Next. So since this is Domestic Violence Awareness Month, I think it's important for all of us just to take pause for a moment and reflect on how our own work as advocates has affected our communities. And speaking about and on behalf of some of the Asian Pacific Islander communities that we work with here at the Institute, over the long haul, what we see are very specific influences. So many Asian Pacific Islander domestic violence service programs got started by advocates and activists in the community. Many of them were part of like a book club or, sort of cultural transmission, teaching their children about culture and singing and dancing and so on. And then at some point, they all kind of moved away from that and sort of said, like, we really have to think about what are the serious problems in our community. And there was so much overwhelming disclosure about domestic violence. So many of these early groups that were there for sort of cultural communities then sort of moved into addressing domestic violence. So we went in our Asian and Pacific Islander communities, we went from denial that domestic violence is not a problem in our community to intense mobilization. And at this point, there are about 150 plus community-based organizations and programs all over the U.S. designed by and for Asian and Pacific Islander women. And we went from silence, which was understood to preserve family honor. We went from there to having women, youth, survivors, LGBTQ survivors, telling their stories, speaking out about abuse, trauma, and also showing us the pathways to resilience and healing. We have gone from victim blaming to looking at different strategies that can change that. I mean, victim blaming is still a huge and persistent issue, but people as advocates, we're looking at how can we alter that equation, that calculus of victim blaming. And for example, in India, there are campaigns to address sexual violence that refer to one campaign that's going on there is making shame change sides. So instead of ascribing shame to victims and survivors, it is about making shame belong and ascribing it to perpetrators and abusers. Frozen culture is a very kind of normative issue we find in many immigrant communities, immigrant and refugee communities, and it refers to the dynamic of when people immigrate or come to a new country, they hang on to beliefs and systems from from the culture of their home country, and they often hang on to it way past its expiration date. So many of these ideas of culture in the home country don't even apply in the home country anymore. But immigrant and refugee communities here in their adopted countries in the U.S. hang on to those old ideas of culture. And so we see with many, with the new and existing generations, activists and advocates pushing back on that and keep trying to, redefine what culture is, because culture isn't this static entity. We've gone from observing very conventional, very traditional family structures, and because of our work around domestic violence, we've all been able to see how these traditional family structures can be harmful and how they, impinge on empowerment and autonomy. And so we're all seeing shifts in how women, men, and gender nonconforming family members are again pushing back on the old norms of what are acceptable gender norms and, insisting on making changes. And I think, again, related to that is how are our rigid gender roles changing? How does our understanding of sharing responsibilities across all the three shifts, the first shift being work outside the home, the second shift being work in the home, mostly parenting and housework, and the third shift being emotional labor. And a lot of it conventionally, of course, men were doing the first shift. That's changed a lot. The second shift of parenting and housework is beginning to shift and change. And then emotional labor has mostly always, again, fallen on women to do, and that is also going to start shifting. So I think that, when we talk about domestic violence awareness, we're often trying to address our communities to raise awareness about the problem and the issue, but it's also important to kind of show how it has benefited changes within our own communities. If you have comments as I'm speaking, please feel free to enter them in the chat. And also if you have comments and examples. Okay, so next. So now I'm going to be talking about domestic violence in Asian Pacific Islander homes, and the shortening is API, so when I use API, you'll know what I'm referring to. So the presence of domestic violence tells us about the presence of inequality in the relationship, and the extent of violence tells us about the extent of the inequality. So think back to some of the examples you have and the situations that you've worked with and addressed in the survivors that come to your program. So the domestic violence that involves, say, pushing and shoving is obviously going to be different from the domestic violence where an intimate partner is pimping out his female partner on a regular basis. So, again, just to reiterate that domestic violence tells us about inequality in the relationship and then the extent of that inequality. Next. This is something you all are quite aware of. Domestic violence is a pattern, and it results in injuries. It results in a climate of subjugation. It establishes fear, dependence, and domination. And, of course, it leads to complex trauma. So just 2 quick points here. Domestic violence is not couples conflict. Many times people confuse that, and when we're presenting on domestic violence, we're often, we see that conflation. Every couple has conflict. Everybody says things that they regret, that they wish they hadn't said, that they can't take back, etc. So it's really important to remind us all that when we're talking about domestic violence, we're talking a systematic pattern for power and control, intimidation, injury, etc. And of course, domestic violence is not caused by stress, which is always the other kind of vernacular that we hear, because we're all experience stress. Women get fired from their jobs, cut off on the freeway, get high, get drunk, all those things, but we don't resort to violence in the degree and frequency that men do. All right. Oh, and sorry, on that point, there are also plenty of non-abusive men who don't use violence. So, women and non-abusive men are exposed to all the stresses that everybody experiences and don't resort to violence. Okay, so let's just look at some data. 26, so this is global data where in different countries, the percentage of women reporting physical or sexual violence by an intimate in their lifetime ranges from 15 to 71%. Next, we look at data in Asia. So 26 to 80% of men perpetrated physical and sexual violence against a partner. Again, a wide range, a big range. In addition, and this data is based on men surveyed in 6 Asian Pacific Islander countries. There's other data that shows in Pacific Islander countries, 64% of Fijians report domestic violence, 46% in Samoa, 40% in Tonga. There's not a lot of Pacific Islander data about people in the U.S., but there's more data about them in their countries and jurisdictions. So I'm going to turn now to looking at data, domestic violence in Asian homes in U.S. data. So according to the CDC, 18.3% of Asian women report domestic violence in the studies that conducted by the CDC. In the data that you see on your screen is from a study that the Institute did of Indian and Filipino and Pakistani women. So the first statistics there, 41 to 61% experience domestic violence. That number comes out of a compilation of various surveys. And I'm sorry, actually, the 41 should be 26%. So I apologize for that error. So a range, so we looked at multiple studies done in the U.S., everything from unpublished dissertations to journal articles and publications to look at the data. And this is the range of reporting domestic violence by Asian women. And 64% of Indians and Pakistanis and 56% of Filipinos reported intimate sexual violence. This was in a study of survivors, so this is amongst survivors, and there were high rates of sexual violence. There were high rates of being stalked, and we also did a study on homicide victims, and 78% of Asian homicide victims were women. 83% of the killers were men. When we look at childhood exposure, this is slightly old data, but it's still telling. There is high levels of family violence within many Asian homes, and as you can see from the numbers on your screen. And then witnessing homicide, again, this is a study done at the Institute. 60 of 63 non-fatal child victims were ear or eye witnesses to their mothers being killed by an intimate. Okay, next. So I'm going to now move to talk specifically about some of the dynamics in the different groups. And some of these dynamics you will see in all groups, but I'm trying to here emphasize the things that are more unique or different to Pacific Islanders and Asians. So looking at physical violence in the domestic violence framework, one of the major differences and differing dynamics that we see is the dynamic of multiple perpetrators, single victim, where violence, abuse, battering, and coercive control in extended family homes is perpetrated by male and female in-laws in addition to the intimate partner, and sometimes even not by the intimate partner, but there can be male and female in-laws, ex-wives, family members of the woman, and they are all participating in abuse. So there can be so you have this dynamic of a single victim facing abuse by her male and female in-laws. And I want to caution us not to sensationalize that, because this is exactly the same dynamic we see in elder abuse. In elder abuse, we see a single victim, an elder, who has multiple perpetrators abusing her or him. The other, and I will talk about the implications of these dynamics, the implications for intervention subsequently in the next slide. So that's the first dynamic I want to point out, stalking. So stalking is, of course, common to all ethnic and identity groups. It's not something specific to our community, to API communities, but there can be also, excessive controls from afar. So an example would be a mother-in-law texting her daughter-in-law from the Philippines, saying, "This is this is the to-do list for today. These are all the things I want you to do." And she'll text the same list to her son and make sure that the daughter-in-law has done all the things on the to-do list that the mother-in-law has given her. So this exercise of abusive controls from afar also runs pretty deep, and many survivors tell us about this form of stalking. And stalking, of course, occurs within the relationship. Most of us are used to thinking about stalking happening after somebody leaves, and then then they're being stalked. But there's a lot of stalking refers to all that monitoring and observance and surveillance. Withholding necessities is another dynamic. These are things like food, healthcare, medication, climate-appropriate clothing, but also just items of daily use. So one abuser used to put all his wife's footwear, all her shoes and everything in the trunk of his car as he drove off to work every day. So she couldn't really go out of the house. They lived in a very cold part of the country, compounding her isolation even further. There are also trivial things that are withheld, soap, shampoo, with a lot of disparaging comments. You're so fat, you're using so much soap, and you're wasting our money and resources. So there's that withholding of necessities, has a sort of insidious, corrosive effect. It's not necessarily abuse, the same kind of abuse as withholding food, but it has that corrosive impact. And you may see when somebody comes into your shelter program that they're really using a lot of shampoo when they wash their hair, or, hoarding soaps or something. And some of that can be explained by understanding what, necessities were withheld as part of the abuse. The other form of physical abuse that we see in API communities is transnational abandonment. This refers to the phenomena of the wife, usually it's a married couple, wife or kids, going to the home country on vacation and then being abandoned there with no way to come back. The husband will keep the wife's passport, the kids' passports. There'll just be one-way plane tickets and so on. So transnational abandonment can happen, is a significant issue that many South Asian survivors tell us about. And related to that, there's another trend called marry and dump. But marry and dump refers to the abandonment happening pretty quickly after the marriage, so sometimes a few months, 3 or 4 months. I worked with a woman who was married in India, came to the airport, came to Boston where her in-laws and husband were supposed to meet her. Nobody showed up at the airport. she had a fictitious address, fictitious name. There was like just nothing. So he was completely untraceable. And others also tell us about this phenomena of marry and dump. And there's quite a bit of awareness in the home countries about this trend, sort of warning women. And people can be dumped either in the U.S. After marriage, or they can be just married in their home countries and then they never manage to come here. And then the last phenomenon I want to address is abusive international marriages. This involves older Asian men who are now Asian American men living in the U.S. who go back to their home countries, marry younger women and teens. And the abuse, sometimes these are often consenting marriages. However, the abusive factors enter into the power differential, into the coercive control that can enter into these relationships. Okay, so what are the implications of these dynamics of physical violence that I described in Asian Pacific Islander communities? So I see a question in the chat that asks, what does the man get when he engages in marry and dump? So there are some responses coming in, which is good, so please keep that up. Yes, so he collects a dowry, and, you know, I think these are questions that we always ask ourselves, like, what do abusers get from their abusive behavior? What is it that they are? I know, of course, we all talk about and understand the dynamics of power and control, but there are so many more subtle and more complicated issues that roll up into that definition of power and control. Right. So so what are the implications of these dynamics that I described? So firstly, I just want to point out the impact of multiple perpetrators, of survivors facing multiple perpetrators. They will have more injuries. There'll be higher levels of coercive control. There'll be higher levels of victim blaming, and then family collusion about what happened. So sometimes when the police are called or a woman goes into the emergency room because of injuries, the family members will collude and say, well, she was trying to kill herself while at home, and so we all had to hold her down and stop her from doing this. So the stories, the narratives show the family collusion. And as a result of this deeper levels of victim blaming and collusion, also the survivors, the internalized devaluation of survivors is driven deeper because everybody is is messaging to her that she's worthless, that she does not need support, that this abuse is deserved by her, or that she's brought it on. So that's one of the pretty significant impacts of multiple perpetrators. The other is the diminished credibility that survivors may have in systems. I remember when I first started working with some of the Asian programs that I was working at, and working with Asian survivors, even I found it hard to believe that there were like 5 and 6 perpetrators in the home. And so, you know, systems personnel are not trained to understand this, and how multiple perpetrators also help, block help seeking, then the credibility of the survivor gets diminished in the systems. Children are very fearful, so in a home with multiple perpetrators, they're fearful of the extended family, they're isolated from their mother. These issues have implications in custody adjudications, where an extended family home may look much more promising and supportive for a child. However, that because there are other abusers in that extended family, it may not be apparent to the custody evaluator. So we have to be sure we sort of bring these issues into the work. So what are the intervention implications? What are the evidence-informed advocacy measures that API advocates have developed? The first is to understand that, the question is the intervention. We know this about all aspects of our work, but that if you ask somebody whether her husband did this to her, or whether her partner did this to her, and she says no, it's not that she's lying, minimizing, or protecting her abuser. She's not denying that the abuse happened. So we have to be able to ask, like, who else was in the room? Who else lives in the home? Who's the extended family? Where were they when these injuries occurred? What were they doing? So we have to be able to ensure that we ask the right questions. Because that is then what the intervention is. We need to determine if there are multiple abusers in the home and what tactics they're using so that we can enhance the safety planning we engage in. We need to be sure we don't assume that accompanying relatives are part of the survivor's support network. So many times the mother-in-law will accompany a woman to a program or to the doctor's office or somewhere, and the assumption is that this is somebody who's helpful and a supportive member, but in fact can be an abuser. We need legal remedies, and many advocates reach for legal remedies that address safety from multiple abusers. So sometimes you have to get a civil protection order because a restraining order against the intimate is not protection enough. And we have to be able to, and many advocates working in community-based organizations are training systems personnel to understand this dynamic of multiple abusers and how to ask about that. So, for example, when the cops show up at the doorstep and the young sister-in-law comes to the door and says, everything's fine, there's no abuse happening, it was a mistake, the cops can go away, whereas the actual survivor or victim is in another room in the house. So again, recognizing that multiple abusers is a dynamic in our community that and how we train systems to respond to that is an important piece that API advocates have been doing in their work. Okay, next. So now I'm going to talk about differing dynamics and in the arena of emotional abuse. So one thing that we, again, see, I think the most significant differing dynamic is what I refer to as push factors out of the relationship rather than pull factors. So most often we hear from survivors about how abusers apologize, offer contrition, promise never to do this again, and so on. And that's genuine. Of course, abusers are contrite, are apologetic, feel terrible about what they've done. In the Asian context, we, of course, and then in that promise never to do this again, it's a way to lure the survivor back into the relationship. What we hear in contrast is that there are, of course, pull factors back into the home, but we also hear a lot about push factors, where abusers and the in-laws will say, we don't need you here, you don't deserve to be here, you're a problem, you need to get out, we can always find another wife for our son, etc. So these push factors can be pretty severe for many survivors in our communities. And if any of you have examples about that, I'd really encourage you to put them in the chat. So I do want to qualify and be sure that you understand that, of course, in Asian communities we do have abusers it isn't just all push factors, that there is contrition, there is apology, there is regret. But I just want to make sure that you understand this other factor of the push of the way women feel pushed out of the home in the relationship. Coercive control, again, is found in all groups. And here, because of the multiple family members in an extended family, it's sort of exercised by more than just the intimate. There's severe isolation, where women are inhibited from contacting the family in the home or other, and being in touch with other support systems that they may have here. And so again, in our programs, it's important to make sure that those contacts can be maintained. It means international phone calls back to family members in the home country. These are easy to provide now, and so we have to think about how the isolation is. How deeply it runs for immigrant and refugee survivors who are away from these contacts and support systems. Using religion and culture to justify abuse. Again, this is happens in all groups, and survivors are silenced from disclosure. They're blamed for bringing dishonor to the family. They're often exiled from the community, so they're not invited to different community events because they spoke up about the abuse. Natal family pressure is another form of emotional abuse where the woman, the survivor's family, is urging her and pressuring her pretty severely to stay in the relationship, to stay in the marriage, to tolerate the abuse, and refusing to help her or even allowing her to return to the family home. And there's a lot of stigma culturally that's been associated with divorce. And some of this is part of the frozen culture piece that I was alluding to. So the stigma attached to divorce has changed in home countries as well, but then in the immigrant refugee communities here, it can be more severely, there can be a stronger attachment to these stigmas and perpetuating and maintaining these stigmas. And similarly, there's a demeaning of widowhood, which is also part of the cultural sort of forms of abuse. Are there any other emotional abuse types that people want to suggest or enter in here? Okay. I'm going to go to the next slide. So what are the implications of these dynamics of emotional abuse, the implications for intervention? What is the evidence-informed advocacy that has developed? So it's important, as I mentioned, to understand the push factors and how these push factors and how claims about culture affect various aspects of intervention and how advocates have built that into their advocacy. So push factors essentially shrink the space for decision-making and for survivor autonomy. So it's important for us as advocates in our intervention to be able to acknowledge and assess the severity of push factors. So a mother who leaves the house to go to a shelter without her children may seem a baffling decision that she made, but I think it's important to understand that sometimes women are pushed so hard out of the house that they cannot take their children. They don't have access even to be able to leave with their children. So these are not, so we need to understand what we think of as decision-making in the context of these push factors. The other thing is around children, so planning early, because of push factors, planning early how mothers and children will leave and stay together in case she is pushed out. It's also looking at and understanding that survivors are afraid and trapped by coercive controls, so we should be careful about how certain strategies or advocacy tools that we have and that we offer are going to lead to empowerment and greater autonomy, but they may not. They may not address the extent of the fear and the sense of entrapment that survivors are experiencing. experiencing. So we should be careful not to just promote this a strategy or an agenda because we understand that it'll be empowering because in the past it's been empowering. And, related to that, I have an interesting example. So in some focus group sessions with Japanese women in Japan, about domestic violence and emotional abuse, they described any attempts to leave or get help as being trapped by a spider web. And what happens in nature when the spider builds a web and then the web traps an insect that is going to be food for the spider, as that trapped insect struggles in the web tightens, actually. And so Japanese survivors were talking about how this web tightens around them as they make more and more attempts to leave or to plan to leave. So I think that's an important analogy to keep in mind. So religion has also been used, as we all know, to force silence and obedience and sacrifice. And many Asian advocates make sure that they're well versed in what actually the accurate information is. So for abusers and family members who say, well, this is allowed in our religion, or our religion says it's okay to beat women, then advocates have armed themselves with information to say, no, this is not how that text or that part of the text is to be interpreted. In terms of help-seeking, I think, again, it's important to prepare survivors to navigate systems and to also be able to work with supportive family members and friends and other community and professional resources. Okay. So next, I'm going to talk about the differing dynamics of sexual violence. And again, this is sexual violence in the intimate partner domestic violence context. Okay. So reproductive coercion. So many of us have been hearing a lot about reproductive coercion, where women are coerced into getting pregnant, not being able to get pregnant, where reproductive methodologies, birth control pills are flushed away. There's all kinds of ways that coercion is exercised. In many Asian communities, I want to point out there's such a high son preference, and so many women feel forced are coerced into multiple pregnancies to produce a son. And despite, dangers to their health, they might have, these multiple repetitive pregnancies. Being forced to watch and imitate pornographic acts. So we hear from survivors about this aspect of sexual violence, and of course there's a lot of shame connected to talking and disclosing any forms of sexual violence, and of course being forced to sort of watch and imitate pornography, which is most pornography now is extremely violent and demeaning. It's not necessarily erotic and arousing, but has this abusive, violent component to it. So we do hear from Asian and Pacific Islander survivors about being forced to watch and imitate pornography. This is all anecdotal data. Infidelity. So women being forced to tolerate their partner's infidelity. This is, again, an issue that happens, we see in all groups. And we also see the sort of parallel phenomena of women being accused and punished for alleged infidelity. Again, this is in many groups, but there are specific forms that happen in API communities. So in some Pacific Islander groups, an abuser just has to allege that he thinks his wife is having an affair, and the woman's own sisters, and sister-in-laws will get together to publicly accuse her of infidelity, of bringing harm and shame to the family, and even sometimes of physically abusing her for that alleged infidelity. So these sort of structures, of family structures, of punishment, dishonor, shaming, are activated very quickly, and abusers know how to exploit these structures. Body shaming and or otherwise referred to as bodily humiliation is something we hear about from many Asian survivors, where it's perpetrated not necessarily just by the intimate partner, but by female in-laws also. So women talk about being forced to disrobe, and whilst female in-laws poke fun at them or even poke at their body parts and demean them. Exposure to HIV and other STIs by transnational husbands. So for Asian women who are married to or partner with people who go back and forth between Asia and the U.S., some of them have second families in their home countries that the wife here does not know about or the partner here does not know about, and some of the men engage in sex tourism, so they come back and they're infecting women who see themselves in a in a marriage where there's no other sexual partners, and so when they get infected, then they're blamed as being, so they're in monogamous relationships by their viewpoint, and then they're being blamed for acquiring HIV or STIs. For many immigrants and refugees, they have experienced sexual violence in their home countries, and this sexual violence has been perpetrated by family members, community members, and sometimes non-state actors. And these histories of sexual violence, women's histories, are then also used and exploited by abusers to shame them. I think back to an example of a woman who was an incest survivor, and she didn't say anything about the incest. She got married. He was a very kind, sweet, loving person, and because of that, she was encouraged then to tell him about the incest that she had experienced at the hands of her father. And he just turned on her. He used that to sort of say, oh, no wonder. He started telling everybody that she was an incest survivor, that this is why she's such a nasty person, can't be trusted, she's so horrible, she's caused all this, anguish in the family, etc. So the point about the example is that past histories of sexual violence that survivors have endured are then used to further violate and harm them. And there's extreme sexual neglect and coldness. Women talk about very little touching, affection, just, cuddling, things like that. And so that also feels like a form of sort of sexual violence to them. And one point I also wanted to bring up, hookup culture. So for many young Asian adults in intimate relationships, they may not be familiar with hookup culture when they go to campus and as college students. Many of them have prohibitions on dating when they were in high school, so they're not familiar with sort of, quote, dating culture, and then hookup culture feels even more unfamiliar. So, and abuses in hookup culture are also harder to identify. Those are some of the dynamics. Is there anything people want to add? Yes, somebody in the chat mentioned how abuse is weaponized against them, so that's a very good point. Thank you for making that and expressing it so succinctly. Next. So we're talking about evidence-informed advocacy as it pertains to sexual violence in intimate relationships. And what are the intervention implications? How do we identify the impact of Asian API culture in informing these advocacy interventions? So firstly, high levels of victim blaming and shaming. This is in all cultures. This is not the monopoly in any one culture. And these high levels of victim blaming and shaming have also been internalized by survivors. So that's the important part to remember, is that it can be it's deeply internalized in all of us because of that culture of gender-based violence that I referred to at the beginning. Victims are also, and survivors are coerced into community and family-designed, quote, solutions when they survive sexual assault. So I think it's really important in our advocacy work to understand and to recognize this coercion and to validate the traumatic impact it has on victims. So let me give you an example. In some Asian groups, women talk about being forced to marry their rapist. So they might be raped, not always stranger danger, somebody they know. As we know, most rapes are perpetrated by assailants who are known to the victim. And a woman may be forced to marry the rapist for several reasons. Firstly, it preserves family honor. So then another reason might be the sort of cultural attitude or family attitude that if she's good enough to rape, she's good enough to marry. So in some cultures, the rapist redeems himself by marrying his victim, and so then he's exonerated, and there are actually no criminal charges filed because he married the victim. And sometimes in certain circumstances, that's also, that form of coercion is exercised. So in refugee camps where there's a fair amount of gender-based violence, a family may agree, may force their raped daughter to marry the rapist so that they can get some more food rations to survive on, and that they will promise not to bring any charges. So there's a quid pro quo that then gets engaged. So I think, it's, again, in terms of our advocacy, as it's important to recognize how these the impact of this coercion and the traumatic impact of it too. So what might seem like an inexplicable act of a woman marrying a rapist, we have to remember to understand how this happened, why this happened. Family rejection is a big dynamic in dealing with when it comes to sexual violence. And as advocates, it's important to identify the context, especially if sexual violence is committed by state actors in conflict zones or by male in-laws. Families reject the survivors because they consider them to be, irrevocably harmed or sullied by these rapes. So our role as advocates is to be able to identify those contexts and understand the level of rejection and the harm that is done to the survivors we're working with. Sometimes survivors might ignore or overlook their injuries, and as advocates, we have to keep in mind that there's a lot of ignorance and shame about the body. There's a lot of ignorance about anatomy. Many times women are not educated about their bodies or their anatomy, in the sort of misbelief that if people don't know anything about anatomy or sex or sexuality, then it's somehow going to be protective. But actually that ignorance is not protective. And so somebody who's not able to describe or explain injuries as a result of sexual violence may may in fact be because of shame and just lack of knowledge and information. So as advocates, we can provide that. Silence is often used to protect family honor, silence about sexual assault. And as advocates, again, it's important for us to acknowledge that for a survivor, that may be self-protective, that it's actually not in her safety interest to disclose that that abuse outside of the advocacy relationship. And advocate discomfort, so one of the things that we've been doing at the Institute is addressing advocate discomfort as a barrier to survivor disclosure. What we found in many of our programs and community members and advocates and survivors were telling us that survivors especially were sort of wanting to talk about sexual violence, but it was hard, and it was hard for advocates to hear this stuff. And partly, as we all know, many of us have our own histories and personal experiences of surviving sexual assault or some form of sexual abuse, and that makes it harder sometimes for us to look at these issues and work with survivors who have very long histories of sexual violence. We may have internalized our own cultural biases, and one of the other things is the issue about language. So many Asian providers will say, well, I don't know what this word is in Vietnamese or Tagalog, or and I don't know how to say rape, or we don't have these words in our language. So it's important to kind of understand how the vocabulary can be a barrier to disclosure, but how it may not be also, and to recognize that we might be using it as we might be that we can address the language issues, because there is going to be language to talk about sexuality and sexual abuse. Okay. And in terms of addressing hooking up and hookup culture when working with young adults and foreign students and campus groups, it's just important to include that in any public education or presentations we make to college students about preventing sexual assault, is to bring in the dynamics of hookup culture. Okay, next. All right, so one area of the dynamics that I want to detail here is the way immigration status is used as a tool of abuse. And there are many different ways that it gets used, and in the current climate, of course, we're seeing additional ways that immigration status and refugee status is used as a tool of abuse. So one thing I want to say about many Asian survivors that we see, immigrant survivors, oftentimes they may have come here with some regular paperwork, and they fall out of status. So their partner is going to either marry them or file the paperwork and so on, but they don't. So that becomes one of the tools of abuse related to the immigration status. So abusers, refuse or neglect to file the paperwork. They don't tell her that they haven't filed it. They keep saying they have, and so this, this means then that she falls out of status, and then her residential status is compromised, of course, and unstable. So what started out as stable immigration status becomes unstable immigration status. The other way that immigration status is used as a tool of abuse is what we're very familiar with, escalated threats about being deported. These have increased in the current climate, where abusers are calling the courthouse and saying she's undocumented, she's going to be at this courthouse at such and such a time for a hearing, and so providing information to ICE so that she does get picked up. So in the current climate about immigration, we see how this has been, these threats have escalated, and these incidents where survivors are reported by their abusers have escalated. Right. There's the exploitation of triple trauma. So triple trauma for refugees refers to the trauma they experience in the conflict zones, the trauma they experience in transit and in camps, and the resettlement trauma stages that they go through. So these multiple traumas are used to silence domestic violence victimization, and many refugee women report how there's so much family disdain that comes to them if they talk about the domestic violence that's happening, because the family has endured so much trauma in the process of moving and becoming refugees. There's also abusers block access to support, to assistance, to benefits, services, English learning classes, job training. Many of these services that are provided in refugee programs, abusers will block, and family members, the woman's family members will also block. There's controlling of economic resources and making false accusations against immigrant survivors so that they will be, again, removed or put in deportation proceedings. Okay. So what are the implications here? I just want to address two areas of how safety planning for immigrant refugee survivors are affected. I want to just ask us to consider for a moment the issue of leaving. So many times in our advocacy work, we see leaving as a safety measure, as a way to, as an option. And leaving has a different meaning for refugee and immigrant survivors. For many of them, they've already left a whole bunch of, a large part of their life behind. For refugees from conflict zones, they've just had to flee from everything they had. So leaving just has a much deeper, painful, harsher meaning and impact on them. So decisions about leaving are not often made in the individual context, but they include the individual, the family, and the community that inform decision making. So it may be hard for an individual survivor to make a decision or consider leaving as an option outside the context of a family-based decision. Life and death assessments of danger are often collective and not individual. And, for refugees who fled the danger of a conflict zone, or immigrants who fled the dangers of being killed, of them and their children being killed by gangs, when they're settled here in the U.S. and there's domestic violence happening, they may not agree with our assessments of this abuser being dangerous to them, because their experience of danger is so different. And so this one person who we as advocates are saying is dangerous, you need to get out, that may not comport with how they assess danger, and especially life and death assessments of danger. And so that impacts this notion that leaving is an option. Also, leaving is connected to irrevocable losses and the trauma of leaving and fleeing and leaving everything behind. And it's also connected to fears of being exiled and losing connection to their own communities here in the U.S. that they've developed. So I just wanted to pose that point about how leaving, for us as advocates, it may be an option, but I think for many Asian service programs, they really have they really grapple with this, with leaving as a safety planning measure. And how do you predicate services on safety that don't involve leaving? And the other point I wanted to make just very quickly is that there's a lot of current immigration enforcement policies that have compromised victim services and victim protections, that have a chilling effect, and victims are not, and survivors are not using services. And so very quickly, these current enforcement policies are around harboring and transportation. They're around detaining survivors, and they're also about the public charge issue, which is how utilizing government benefits will jeopardize adjustment of status. So these are very complicated matters. I obviously can't go into them here. We have several publications on our website and resources, and there will be a webinar on the 25th of October on the public charge issue. Okay, next. So other dynamics of domestic violence in our communities, these are common to most groups. I'll just go through them quickly. There's abuse directed at mothers, disrupting maternal-child bonding, threatening loss of custody, false allegations of child abuse, stigmatizing divorced mothers and single mothers. There's abuse in LGBTQ trans relationships. So many communities where homophobia is pretty deep, and so there are elevated risks and harms for for survivors in queer or trans relationships, because this homophobia can be pretty, is quite prevalent in many Asian groups. And therefore there are elevated systems risks. I'm not going to go through the implications for these. I'm just going to just talk about them briefly. And then the last type of abuse I want to address is elder abuse. Most of these things everyone is familiar with. I just want to emphasize the hyper-exploitation of household labor and childcare. So many family members might be brought to the U.S. and then they're used to do just endless amounts of work in the household: childcare, laundry, cooking, washing, cleaning, everything. So that is one form of elder abuse that may not seem very obvious. It may seem lovely that the grandparents are living with their grandchildren and with their kids, and you have this extended family home, but this is a form of elder abuse that's important to look out for. There's also the demeaning and isolation of widows. Another caution that I want to focus on is our killings. So there can be suicide pacts, mercy killings, and we often have to pause and try to understand the context, the family context, whether there was abuse or not, and whether these apparently sort of suicide pacts between couples, whether they were in fact coerced, and whether mercy killings are also coerced, and especially in suicide pacts where the abuser doesn't in fact die. So I just wanted to kind of mention some of these dynamics, and just quickly, here are some concluding points that summarize some of the points I've already made about API-specific dynamics and what it means to address them. And next slide. So I'm going to change tracks a little bit, and I talked in all the previous part of this webinar about culturally informed interventions, but we also did some work here at the Institute to look at and to collect data, both quantitative and qualitative data, on what API serving programs are actually addressing and the range of the work that they're doing. We named this model the A to Z advocacy model because A to Z represents kind of everything it takes to do this work. And we just wanted a simple, straightforward kind of imagery connected to this rather than some idiomatic phrase. And so with regards to the notion of an A to Z advocacy model, we developed an inventory of the several aspects of the work of the advocacy that API advocates and community-based organizations are doing. So the inventory discusses for every letter of the alphabet, the type of GBV, gender-based violence, the ethnicity served, the demographic group served, seniors, teens, refugees, etc., and the languages that of service that are provided. And then it discusses the prevention. It also enumerates the prevention and intervention strategies. So you'll see the link to all these resources. So the A to Z model, as you can see, it's an inventory of evidence-informed practices that are responsive to trends in gender violence that we see in API communities, and that also address the great diversity in different API groups between, say, Vietnamese and Thai, but also then within groups, so within South Asian groups, within Pacific Islanders, etc. And the model is anchored in 5 principles. I'm just going to discuss 3 of them. So the first principle is about survivor-centered advocacy is based on culturally specific definition and analysis of domestic violence and related barriers. So what we were trying to do in the A to Z report is to show how advocates designed and developed programs to address what they were actually seeing. Excuse me a moment. So we were trying to capture the way the work is being done, and everyone started off with kind of standard understanding and definition of domestic violence, but then as you see in just the earlier stuff that I presented, domestic violence can look quite different. And so this meant that one principle of the A to Z model is that there has to be a culturally specific definition of domestic violence and the related barriers. And what does this mean for survivors? It means that survivors don't have to explain cultural and familial contexts of abuse and community-generated barriers. So they don't have to explain that the in-laws are being abusive. It's understood when they describe that they don't have to explain community-generated barriers in great detail. So the family members who say, well, he's such a well-respected pediatrician, no one's going to believe you when you report that he's an abuser. How can you sort of ruin his reputation or his practice? And those kind of barriers that the community members and family members throw up, they don't have to explain those to advocates who understand the cultural nuances of abuse. Survivors don't have to feel scrutinized because they're not acculturated, so which is what happens when they encounter systems and non-API specific programs. There's a fair amount of criticism or maybe covert that they're not acculturated, they've been living here so long and they don't know how to fit in or not part of American culture. Survivors also don't have to fear that their disclosure will be sensationalized to confirm racist stereotypes, stereotypes such as Asian women are so submissive or Asian men are so violent. And again, because the context is understood, the cultural context and these definitions of domestic violence have been expanded to be meaningful. And very important to survivors is the expectation that interventions and support that they get from advocacy will not disrupt their connection to community. So if we look at, so what are the implications for community-based programs serving Asians and Pacific Islanders? One of the things we see is that even small CBOs offer a really wide range of services, and that they are disproportionately relied on by mainstream programs to support and provide services for API survivors, where that is the responsibility of all programs, not necessarily just the API programs. So here's some data. Of the 160 API serving programs we surveyed for this project, 51% reported some type of shelter and housing, 86% have 18 types of support services, the top two being case management and interpretation, that's language interpretation, and 88% provide some type of legal services, the top three being court accompaniment, protection orders, and immigration law assistance. Okay. So what's the second principle of the A to Z model? It was, oh, sorry, one moment, I lost my spot. Yeah. So the second principle is that interventions have to integrate the impacts of life course abuse and also integrate the positive and negative help-seeking experiences that survivors describe and talk about. And by integrating life course abuse and help-seeking experience, there's an expanded inventory of culturally specific practices. So what does that mean for API survivors? It means that culturally specific services actually reinforce DV survivors' trust in their advocate. And one of the things we see is that when people may go to a domestic violence program, but then they can also talk about sexual violence or other histories of undisclosed histories of abuse over the life course. And many advocates see disclosures about incest perpetration, all kinds of abuses over the life course because of this rapport and trust that's established in the DV advocacy context. Also, by integrating these aspects into the work and developing a culturally specific advocacy stance, there's increased access to services for API survivors, and the barriers to these services are mitigated because services are not compartmentalized. And finally, the lifetime spiral also shows the historical nature of abuse. Because it shows the historical nature of abuse, it reassures survivors that it's not their fault. It removes the onus on survivors, and it allows for survivors to talk about culturally specific traumas and resilience and healing. Okay. So here's a little bit of data. I'm sorry, I know the font size is kind of small, but it's from the report. And what we found was that API serving programs address over 90 types of abuse. And so this is important to illustrate that services are not compartmentalized. So many programs started off only addressing domestic violence, but now 69% of programs address sexual violence and sexual assault, 44% address abuse by in-laws, 36% address forced marriage, 35% address trafficking, and LGBTQ intimate partner violence. I think there's an error in that it's 28% of programs, not 48%, address LGBTQ intimate partner violence. So programs, by understanding and analyzing life course exposure to abuse, they have been able to integrate these forms of abuse into their advocacy and address them. Okay, the last principle is that services are designed to address the incredible diversity. So there's huge diversity across API communities. There are over 50 languages and so on. So what does this mean for there's both ethnic diversity and language diversity? So what it means for survivors is that they know they're not sort of lumped into a single Asian category, and that advocates can differentiate the cultural context and language needs. So of 56 API ethnicities served by the 160 programs we surveyed, 41 were Asian ethnic groups and 15 were Pacific Islanders. So this differentiation between cultural groups, the intra-API diversity, is also well understood, and that's another important factor. So, for example, in South Asia, there's 6 countries technically part of South Asia, a large diaspora, but there are multiple differences within South Asian groups based on religion, language, etc. Even for a smaller country like Myanmar, there's Karen Burmese, there's Chin, there's Karenni, so there's a whole range of differences within each API group. And that's been a very important principle to address, that has been addressed. So bilingual and multilingual advocates increase access to services and navigation within systems. And also, survivors with limited English proficiency feel that they are respected. They're not seen as ignorant or uneducated or dumb just because they don't speak English, which is a very important aspect to survivor empowerment. So just very quickly about languages. The 160 programs we surveyed, they offer 100 services in 121 different languages. 75 of these languages are Asian and Pacific Islander languages, and 46 are non-API languages. What I want to emphasize here, so you can see on this data the different levels of language service that are provided, but what I want to emphasize here is the last bullet, which is that 38% have telephonic or in-person interpretation for languages that they cannot address. So many API programs have different API languages that they have services in, that they have advocates on site. But for the languages they cannot serve, they have contracts for telephonic interpretation. And this is really critical because all programs receiving federal funding are required to provide language access. And API programs not only have staff that can address language diversity, but they also arrange for other languages other language groups to be served. Okay, so I want to, this is my penultimate point. Just want to remind everybody about interpretation and language access. That, as I mentioned, Title VI requires compliance for programs receiving federal money to provide language access. And our Interpretation Technical Assistance Resource Center provides a lot of training on many of these issues, on all these issues. I just want to remind all of you about a few salient points. That bilingual speakers versus trained interpreters have different skills and roles in providing services. That interpretation is most often in consecutive mode, which means the speaker says a few sentences, then the interpreter interprets that, and which requires, again, skills like memory, tracking, the storyline, etc. Bilingual speakers should use the first person, should not summarize. I want to point out the culturally acceptable ways. So many times bilingual advocates or interpreters even will say that, oh, in our culture, it's rude to talk about rape or to address sexual violence with these direct terms. But it's really important to not use, quote, culturally acceptable ways of addressing sexual assault, to use the vocabulary of the survivor. And I suggest that it's just running down to point 8, which is that it's important to work with interpreters trained on domestic violence and sexual assault, so they're familiar with the dynamics and the vocabulary. And this is something that at the Institute we also provide. And by the way, all our work on language access and interpretation is for all languages. It's not, it's not confined to API language groups at all. So it's for all groups. And just a few key reminders about interpretation. And that brings me next to our last PowerPoint, which is to ask us all the question in Domestic Violence Awareness Month, what kind of cultures do we want? And we want cultures where gender parity or gender democracy, not gender violence, is the norm. And we want cultures where relationships of power are replaced by relationships of meaning. And please add your thoughts in the chat about what kind of cultures you want. Thank you. So that concludes the webinar today. If you have questions, you can contact us for any technical assistance, resources. If you would like us to do some specific training for your agency and your partner agencies, we can do all of that. That's part of our project, and that's part of our funding. So we provide training and technical assistance on issues affecting API survivors of gender-based violence. Thank you very much for being a great audience, and for all your comments and participation, and for the work you do.
Thank you all for joining. You all will all be directed to an evaluation link once you leave the webinar. Please fill that out and let us know what you thought of today's event. Thank you all, and have a great day.